They say justice is blind, but that day in the courtroom, justice had eyes wide open and it saw blood and humiliation on my face. The sound of his hand slapping against my skin was so loud it silenced the entire room. For 2 seconds, no one breathed. No one moved. I could taste copper in my mouth, and the weight of centuries pressed down on my chest. He was a police officer. I was a lawyer. But in that moment, in his eyes, I was nothing more than a black woman he thought he could break. He thought wrong. I was raised to believe that the law was the great equalizer, the one shield strong enough to protect me from the world's ugliest truths. But that slap shattered the illusion. The courtroom, with its high ceilings and flags of authority, suddenly felt like a stage where history repeated itself, over and over, in a cruel echo. Yet even through the sting on my cheek, I could feel something rising inside me. Not shame, not fear, fire. He wanted me small. I decided to stand taller. He wanted silence. I gave him words sharper than any blade. He wanted to remind me of my place. That was the mistake that would cost him his. The case we were arguing wasn't just about a young black boy wrongfully accused of theft. It was about a system stacked high with prejudice, a system that laughed at our pain and dressed cruelty in the uniform of authority. And when his hand struck me, he handed me the one piece of evidence I needed to tear the mask off that system in front of everyone who thought it could not be touched. The judge shifted uneasily in his chair, gavel trembling in his hand but refusing to strike. The jury stared, wide-eyed, their sense of order cracking like glass. The people in the gallery gasped, their phones already raised, recording, streaming, sharing. The courtroom had transformed into an arena, and every eye was on me. I had seconds to choose, break down or rise up. I looked at him, the officer, his chest heaving with the arrogance of someone who had gotten away with this too many times before. He smirked, daring me to call it what it was. Racism, abuse, brutality. And I did. My voice did not tremble. It roared. I began not with anger, but with truth. I told them how every slap like this, whether delivered by a hand, a law, or a silence, was part of the same chain that bound us for centuries. I told them about my grandmother, who had been denied a seat at a lunch counter. About my father, pulled over so many times he had lost count. About my brother, who learned at 15 that his skin was a weapon in the eyes of men in blue. And now about May, a lawyer, in her own courtroom, struck like a criminal in front of a judge and jury. I made them see that this slap was not just mine. It belonged to every black man, woman, and child who had ever been told they were less. The officer's smirk faltered. The golden light through the courtroom windows grew brighter, as if even the sun refused to look away. The jury shifted in their seats, no longer just observers, but witnesses of a crime unfolding in real time. The judge opened his mouth, but I raised my hand first. My words cut through the silence like glass through silk. I told the courtroom that justice demanded more than silence. That if the law could not protect me here, in this room, then it was worth less than paper. And then, I asked for the impossible, not just justice for my client, but accountability for the man who had just struck me. The courtroom erupted. His badge suddenly weighed heavy on his chest, not a symbol of authority anymore, but of shame. And I wasn't finished. What happened next would shake every corner of that courthouse, strip away every excuse, and force the world to watch as one man's arrogance became the rope that hung his career. The silence that followed was heavier than chains. The judge leaned back, his face pale, his gavel still trembling in his hand. For the first time in my career, I realized that even a man sworn to uphold justice could be terrified of it. He glanced at the officer, then at me, then back again, as if waiting for someone else to decide the weight of what had just happened. His lips parted, but no words came. That silence, that cowardice, spoke louder than anything he could have said. The officer shifted uneasily now. The arrogance in his stance cracked just a little, the corners of his mouth twitching like he wasn't sure if he should still wear his smirk. He looked around the room, searching for allies, but none dared meet his eyes. The courtroom had become my stage, and though I never asked for it, destiny had placed a spotlight on me. My cheek throbbed with heat. The sting was not just physical, it was generational, an echo of wounds carved into our people long before I was born. But I refused to let it disfigure me. Instead, I transformed it into evidence, into testimony. My voice carried across the chamber, steady as stone. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I said, ignoring the startled protest of the judge. What you have just witnessed is not an accident. It is not a loss of temper. It is a revelation. It is the mask of authority slipping, just long enough to show you the truth beneath it. This is not just about my client. This is about every single person who has ever walked into this courthouse carrying the weight of skin darker than ivory. A murmur rippled through the gallery. I could feel the phone still raised, capturing every word. This was no longer confined to four walls. This was spilling out into the world, into feeds, into timelines, into conversations that could not be silenced. The officer tried to interject, his voice booming. She's twisting this. She provoked. I cut him off, my voice sharper, stronger. I provoked nothing but his hatred, his prejudice, his arrogance. And when the uniform of justice is worn by a man who believes his power gives him the right to strike me down, then justice itself is in danger. The judge banged his gavel weakly, but it was too late. The jury was leaning forward now, their eyes fixed on me, their pens forgotten, their hearts engaged. I had them. I had them in a place no legal textbook could teach you how to reach. The officer's attorney shifted in his seat, whispering frantically to his client, but the officer pushed him off. His pride was a leash that would drag him deeper into the pit he had dug. And I would not stop him. I turned back to my client, a young black boy with trembling hands, his eyes wide, as if witnessing both horror and hope at once. You see, I said, my voice softening only for him. They wanted to make you the criminal. But the real crime is standing right in front of them, wearing a badge. The boy's mother began to cry quietly, covering her mouth, shaking with a mix of fear and vindication. That sound cut through me like a blade, but it also fueled me. Because her tears weren't just grief anymore. They were release. The judge finally found his voice. Counselor, control yourself. You are turning this courtroom into a spectacle. I turned my eyes on him, unblinking. The spectacle was made the moment he struck me. Your Honor. The law is not theater until those who are supposed to guard it turn it into one. I am not the author of this scene. I am the witness. My words left him frozen. He looked down, ashamed, and for a second, I thought he might actually see himself clearly in the mirror I had held up. The officer stepped forward suddenly, his jaw tight, his voice rising. You think this changes anything? You think one slap erases the truth? That kid is still guilty, and you? I stopped him with a raised hand. No, that kid is innocent. And every time you open your mouth, you prove why. His face reddened. He looked at the jury, desperate, but their eyes were cold now, no longer allies. He turned to the judge, but the judge avoided his gaze. In desperation, he pointed at me. She's making this about race. The words fell like ash. I stepped closer, letting the golden sunlight from the windows cast over my shoulder, illuminating the bruise on my cheek. No, I said softly, yet it cut sharper than a shout. You made this about race the moment you put your hand on me. Silence again. The kind that suffocates. The kind that tells you the world has shifted and nothing will return to how it was. I let that silence work for me. I let it sink into their bones. And then, I turned back to the jury. I ask you now not just to deliver a verdict for my client. I ask you to deliver a verdict for the truth. For the dignity of every person who has ever walked into this room believing that justice belongs to them too. The boy's mother sobbed louder. Someone in the gallery whispered, Amen. The officer clenched his fists, shaking, his authority unraveling thread by thread. He didn't know it yet, but his career was already over. The phones in the gallery had seen to that. The videos were already racing across the city, the state, maybe the country. By the time he left this room, he would not be a protector of law but the face of its betrayal. I had planted the seed. Now the world would water it. The judge, cornered by the weight of what he had allowed, cleared his throat. Officer, you will remove yourself from this courtroom at once. The officer froze. What? You heard me. Bailiff. But the bailiff hesitated, glancing at me first, as if waiting for my permission. That hesitation alone told me the power had shifted. The badge no longer commanded obedience. The truth did. The officer's chest rose and fell rapidly, rage flooding his face. For a moment, I thought he might strike again. But then he caught the cold stares of the jury, the pity in the gallery, the steady camera lenses pointed at him. And in that instant, he realized his world had collapsed. The authority he thought untouchable had turned on him. He backed away slowly, his lips curled in a snarl. "This isn't over," he hissed at me. I met his eyes with steady fire. "Oh, it is." He stormed toward the exit, but every step he took was the step of a man walking into the graveyard of his career. The door slammed behind him, and the sound echoed like a final verdict. I turned back to the courtroom. The golden light shifted again, warmer now, softer, wrapping me in something that felt like both armor and embrace. The bruise on my cheek still burned, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like proof. "Let us continue," I said, my voice steady, almost calm. And as the courtroom sat in awed silence, I pressed forward with the case, weaving his violence into the very fabric of my closing argument. Every word became a stone in the foundation of justice we were building. And deep down, I knew the trial was no longer about one boy accused of theft. It was about a system accused of hatred. And for once, the system would be forced to answer. The trial pressed on, but the air in that room was no longer the same. The atmosphere had shifted like a storm had just rolled through, leaving everyone drenched and raw. Even the judge, who once carried himself with untouchable authority, now looked like a man standing on thin ice, every movement careful, cautious, fragile. The jury, though still silent, leaned forward in their seats with a hunger I had not seen before. They were no longer simply arbiters of a boy's fate. They were witnesses to a reckoning. I continued my argument, letting every word drip with purpose. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The courtroom was so still that even a whisper carried like thunder. "You saw it," I said, my gaze sweeping over the 12 faces that held my client's future in their hands. Not just the slap. You saw the hatred behind it. You saw the power abused, the uniform weaponized, the silence of those who should have stopped it. If this boy can be accused without evidence, if I can be struck without consequence, then tell me what chance does justice have for anyone who looks like us? One juror, a middle-aged woman with gray streaks in her hair, shifted uncomfortably. She glanced at the bruise still swelling on my cheek, then at the boy trembling in his seat beside me. For the first time, I saw her wipe a tear from her eye. That was the moment I knew the tide was turning. The prosecutor tried to salvage control, standing up with forced authority. "Your Honor," he said, "this line of speech is inflammatory and irrelevant to the case at hand. We are here to determine whether this young man stole property, not to put the police department on trial." I turned my head slowly toward him, my voice cutting like glass. The police department put itself on trial the moment one of its own raised his hand against me in open court. Do you want relevance? That is relevance. The prosecutor's face reddened, his composure cracking. "Counselor," I didn't let him finish. "No. Let me remind you, in this court, that my client was accused by that very officer who just revealed his prejudice for the world to see. His testimony is tainted. His integrity shattered. Every word he has spoken against my client is poisoned by the very racism that made his hand strike me. You want to talk about relevance? That is the beating heart of this case." Gasps fluttered through the gallery. The judge lifted his gavel, but set it down again. He knew there was no stopping this. I had spoken the truth, and the truth, once unleashed, does not return quietly to its cage. The young boy beside me whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." His voice shook with disbelief, with relief, with the fragile hope of someone who had been told his life was worth less. I squeezed his shoulder gently. "We're not finished," I murmured back. Then I rose to deliver the closing argument. My steps felt heavier than ever, weighted with history, but they also felt certain, inevitable. I could almost hear my ancestors walking with me, every one of them whispering strength into my bones. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, standing tall, the golden sunlight still pouring through the windows, catching the edges of my navy suit like a crown of fire. This case began as an accusation of theft. A boy, a black boy, was accused of taking something that did not belong to him. But ask yourself what has been stolen here today. Was it a wallet, or was it dignity? Was it property, or was it equality? I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the words sink deep. This boy's innocence was stolen by the presumption of guilt stamped onto his skin. My dignity was stolen by the slap of a man who thought his badge gave him the right to silence me. And your trust, ladies and gentlemen, has been stolen by a system that allowed this to happen in front of your very eyes. I let the words breathe. The gallery hung on every syllable. The jury's faces were rapt, some furious, some ashamed, but none indifferent. You were asked to weigh the evidence. I continued. Well, you saw the evidence. You saw it with your own eyes. The violence, the contempt, the hatred. Do not tell me that was irrelevant. Do not tell me to separate what is inseparable. The law does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in this world, in this courtroom, in our lives. And if it cannot protect us here, then it protects no one at all. The judge swallowed hard, his knuckles white on the bench. The prosecutor sat back down, defeated, his notes useless. The boy's mother wept openly, clutching her hands together as if in prayer. And the jury? They were no longer just jurors. They were witnesses to history. The final words of my closing rang through the chamber like a bell. Do not just deliver a verdict for this boy. Deliver a verdict for justice. Deliver a verdict that says we are not invisible, that we are not disposable, that we are not less. I sat down, heart pounding but steady. The room seemed to exhale all at once. The judge cleared his throat, voice trembling. The jury will now retire to deliberate. They rose, 12 people carrying the weight of centuries on their shoulders. I watched them file out, my cheeks still burning, my client still shaking. And then we waited. The gallery buzzed in hushed whispers. Some people prayed. Others typed furiously into their phones, no doubt broadcasting every moment to the world beyond these walls. The officer was gone, but his shadow still lingered, thick and oppressive. My mind wandered to the videos already spreading, already igniting conversations in homes, in offices, in streets. This trial was no longer ours alone. It belonged to everyone watching, everyone who had ever wondered if justice was truly theirs to claim. Hours passed. The courtroom grew restless, but I sat still, breathing, holding onto the silence as if it were a weapon. My client kept glancing at me, his fear written across his face. What if they don't believe us? He whispered. I turned to him, meeting his eyes with all the certainty I could gather. They already do. Believe me. They saw everything they needed to see. Finally, the jury returned. 12 faces, solemn, carrying verdicts carved into their bones. The judge called for order, though his voice betrayed his nerves. Has the jury reached a decision? The forewoman, the gray-haired woman who had wiped her tears earlier, stood. We have, Your Honor. My heart thundered in my chest. Not for myself, but for the boy beside me, for his mother clutching her hands so tightly her knuckles had gone white. On the charge of theft, the forewoman said, we find the defendant not guilty. The boy's mother let out a sob that shook the room. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling with relief so deep it seemed to shatter him. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the word innocent wash over me like water after a long drought. But the forewoman wasn't finished. She glanced at the judge, then at me, then at the gallery. Furthermore, she said, her voice steady but loud enough to carry, we recommend this court refer the officer's conduct to the state attorney for immediate investigation of misconduct, assault, and abuse of power. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, clapping, chaos. The judge banged his gavel desperately, but it was useless. The truth had broken free, and no wooden hammer could contain it. The boy turned to me, tears streaming down his face. I'm free, he whispered. I squeezed his hand. You always were. Today, they finally saw it. And as I looked out at the gallery, at the faces alight with shock and vindication, I knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of something far bigger. Because a slap meant to silence me had become the spark to burn down a wall centuries high. The verdict should have been the end, but in truth, it was only the beginning. The courtroom had erupted into chaos, phones still raised high, voices shouting, tears streaming. I sat there for a moment, frozen in the eye of the storm, my cheeks still burning with the memory of his hand, my heart steady despite the whirlwind around me. My client was free. That mattered more than anything. But I could feel it in my bones. This story would not die here. It was already alive in the world beyond these four walls. The bailiff tried to restore order, shouting over the noise, but his voice was drowned out by the hum of something larger, justice finally being spoken aloud, unfiltered, undeniable. The judge called for a recess, his gavel striking wood again and again, desperate, almost pleading. But no one was listening. Justice had slipped from his grasp and landed in the hands of the people. The boy's mother embraced me, her tears soaking into my suit jacket. She whispered, "You saved him. You saved us." I shook my head softly. No, the truth saved him. We just refused to let it be buried. As we spoke, the doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. Reporters surged inside, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward. Somehow, the video had spread faster than wildfire. By the time the jury announced not guilty, the world outside already knew what had happened. I could see the headlines forming in their eyes. Black female lawyer slapped in court by white officer turns tables in minutes. The moment was no longer mine. It belonged to history. They asked me for a statement, their voices colliding in a storm of questions. But I didn't answer not yet. I wasn't going to turn this into a soundbite. Not when it was something far deeper. Instead, I gathered my client and his family, shielding them as we walked past the flashing lights, out of the courtroom, into the chaos waiting beyond. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with people. Some had come because they saw the video. Others because they had lived it in their own way and wanted to stand witness. Protest signs had already appeared, hastily written but burning with truth. Justice isn't blind. Our skin is not a crime. The crowd parted as we stepped down, and for a moment, golden sunlight poured over us, brighter than it had been all day. It caught the bruise on my cheek, lighting it like a badge of honor. Reporters shouted, protesters chanted, cameras rolled. And I realized the officer could not hide. Not from this. Not anymore. Because while we stood there in the sun, he was escorted out the side entrance by two internal affairs investigators, his face twisted in rage and fear. He caught sight of me from a distance. Our eyes locked for one last time. He had no smirk now, no arrogance, only the hollow eyes of a man who finally realized his power had ended. And I didn't need to say a word. The world was already speaking for me. His suspension was immediate. His badge stripped. By nightfall, the video had spread across the country, igniting protests in cities I had never been to, chanted by voices I had never met. But they weren't chanting for me. They were chanting for themselves, for their children, for everyone who had carried the same bruise, whether on their skin, in their hearts, or in their memories. And I watched, both humbled and awed, as something larger than my case took root. But victory is never clean. That night, as I sat in my office, the silence pressing heavy around me, the cost settled in. I was exhausted beyond words. My hands shook as I removed the suit jacket, stained with the tears of a mother whose son had almost been lost. My cheek throbbed, not just from the strike, but from the weight of being the one to stand in its aftermath. And the fear whispered at the edges of my mind. What if they come after me? What if the system finds a way to crush me for daring to fight back? But then I remembered the boy's face when the words, "not guilty," rang through the room. I remembered the sound of the crowd outside, chanting not in despair, but in defiance. And I realized fear could not be my compass. Only truth could. Days turned into weeks. The officer's fall was swift and brutal. His past surfaced like rot floating to the top of water, complaints of excessive force, whispers of racial profiling, patterns ignored for too long. Now the world saw it, and the world did not forgive. He became a symbol, not of power, but of corruption. He lost his badge, his pension, his shield. And everywhere he went, people pointed, whispered, remembered. But it wasn't about him anymore. It was about us. About what had been sparked that day in the courtroom. Lawsuits piled against the department. Policies were questioned. Training was demanded. And for once, it felt like cracks were forming in a wall that had stood too long. Yet I knew better than to call it victory. Racism does not collapse in a single day or a single slap. It lingers. It adapts. It fights back. But we had proven it could be exposed. That the truth, if shouted loudly enough, could pierce even the thickest armor of denial. One evening, I visited the boy and his family. He was smiling for the first time since I met him, playing cards with his younger sister at the kitchen table. His mother hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. She whispered, "Because of you, my son gets to grow up." I held her close and whispered back, "Because of him, the world had to look in the mirror." That night, I walked home under the glow of streetlights, my steps slow, my body heavy, but my spirit steady. The city hummed with noise cars, voices, music spilling from open windows. Life moved on, but I knew something inside it had shifted. And as I passed a mural painted hastily on a brick wall, me cheek, my bruise, my fire staring back at me, realized the story was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves in it. The mural's golden hues glowed in the lamplight, the same gold that had poured through the courtroom windows that day, the same gold that had turned my pain into proof. And I understood. The slap meant to silence me had done the opposite. It had made me a voice, not just for myself, but for all of us. And that was a weight I was willing to carry. Because as long as there were voices shouting, hearts beating, and truth burning, the system could be challenged. And just as fragile, elusive, unfinished could still rise. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.